Thanks, glad to be here. I'm going to run through the PowerPoint's just a small portion of what we're going to go through here, and it's just to provide some background on congressional offices and how to interact with congressional staff. Standard disclosure slides. Ross introduced himself. That's basically him. I'm from Alaska. I'm stationed with the Air Force in Cincinnati, Ohio as a trauma surgeon, as well as I teach the critical care air transport class for the Air Force. And my background is that prior to ever going to medical school or pursuing a career in medicine, I had a separate career as a health policy advisor in the Senate. And so I worked in the Senate offices, worked through several different positions there, and have quite a bit of understanding of how the process works as we passed a number of big healthcare bills during that time period. Since coming through my medical training, I've served on the Surgeons PAC Board of Directors, and I'm currently the American College of Surgeons, one of our delegates to the American Medical Association. So with that, this is generally what we're going to be doing. This is the briefing that we'll be doing up front, breakouts, and then have maybe some time for discussion and questions at the end. So basic principles of advocacy. I broke this down into two general areas. The people, we'll talk about congressional staffing and how the offices work, why you need to know who these people are, and how to make that process work. Second of all, we'll talk about the process, mostly just the meeting, things to know going into a meeting, things to prepare for, and how to essentially move the needle in those meetings. And then just as an added bonus, some absolutely worthless DC trivia that you can impress people with at cocktail parties when you're in DC. So relevance. So when I worked in the Senate, I guess I have a little bit of a different view on whether advocacy works. Having been a staffer, I saw a lot. I spent a fair amount of my time responding to people who brought issues directly to the senator, and they came down to me, and we had to solve them and solve them rapidly. There were a series of physicians. I remember a number of cases where she would hand the telephone to somebody. She was up in the state in meetings, and somebody was having a healthcare issue. She would hand the cell phone over to that person and then have them talk to me, and then we had to solve it from the DC office, and that made for some very long days. But the other thing is that talking about when docs came either as part of the American Medical Association or their specialties and met with the senator over the course of years, they brought up several of the same issues over and over again. And I remember one time we were sitting in a committee meeting. An issue came up, a surprise amendment came up on a particular issue that the docs had been coming down and consistently talking to her about, and she leaned back and said, "Hey, isn't this the issue that they've been talking about for a while?" And it was. And ultimately, because she was aware of it and was something that she'd been briefed on multiple times by physicians from her state, she voted against the recommendations of the party and actually was the deciding vote on changing the policy. So there's ways, so by being consistent and by being, talking about ways to be effective here, these actually can move the needle and actually change policy. And what I want to do here is to show you some of those basic principles and some keys on how to interact with members of Congress and their staff. So in between these, we'll be doing these useless DC trivia bits. So by looking at the Capitol building, how can you tell whether or not Congress is in session? Anybody know? Yeah, it's the cupola light. If that light's on in the cupola, the Congress is in session. If the light's off, Congress is not in session. And so that's one of the ways that... Yeah. I didn't say they were effective. I said it was in session. Nobody's on the floor, but it's in session.
Just see if your member of Congress knows that.
That's right. All right. So first, we're going to go through the people. So this is just a primer on congressional staffing. So this is a conceptualized view of how congressional staff works. We'll break it down by location. So the first location that we'll talk about, so geographically, congressional staff are either located in DC or back in the state and in the district. So we'll talk about the DC staff first, and what we'll do is we'll start at the top and work our way down. Beyond the member, the chief of staff is generally the first person that a member of Congress hires when they come to Washington, D.C. This is generally somebody who's worked with them through the campaign, is very familiar with who they are, what they believe, and how they think. The chief of staff generally acts pretty autonomously in terms of hiring staff. They're the ones in charge of hiring the staff, firing the staff, and making sure that everything that happens in the congressional office reflects the views of the member and keeping all of those things on target. The next person down is the legislative director. So when you talk about the senior staff, these are the two individuals who generally guide the policy at the will of the member. The legislative director is kind of the policy wonk. They're the person who's supposed to know generally enough about all the different issues and what the member believes and what their principles are so that they can guide the legislative staff in how to draft and advise on legislation. The legislative director oversees the core legislative staff. That's these two groups of people, the legislative assistants and legislative correspondents. So any given office, so a legislative assistant is a policy advisor. And in any given office, there's usually between 3 and 12 legislative assistants, depending on the size of the office. And as you can imagine, if there are only 3, then each of them hold a significant burden of a bunch of different issues. You may be, yeah. Correct. It's based on, so generally the House of Representatives has a smaller budget for each of the individual offices. For Senate side, for offices that share particularly committee chairmen, they will typically have additional staff to support the additional committee work that they do. So if you're a chairman or chairwoman of the Senate Finance Committee, you're going to have additional staff because you need to focus on the tax implications of healthcare and Medicare and Medicaid more than junior members who may not be as able to affect the policy along the way. It's something that Congress writes their own rules, so just telling you what they wrote. So legislative assistants, they generally provide the policy advising and they write the briefings for the senator or a member of Congress. And they're also, between the two of these two folks, are the folks that you generally meet with when you go to Washington, D.C. The legislative correspondents they typically handle correspondence, so they will reply on behalf of the senator or the House of, or the member of Congress to constituents for mail and things that are sent in. So like I was saying about the legislative assistant, the portfolio is pretty variable, so you can have legislative assistants that focus on very narrowly on an issue area or very broadly. So for example, my assigned area was health and social policy, but even though I was the health policy advisor, if you were coming to talk about a Department of Defense health issue or a VA health issue, that was actually under somebody else. So the reason that I tell you that is that it's important when you're scheduling a visit to talk to your member of Congress that you provide the scheduler with the general information that you're going to talk about, not necessarily everything specific, but so that they can schedule you with the right person, because the boundaries on who deals with what is not always perfectly clear. So that's the legislative staff. So the legislative staff was the legislative director and the legislative assistants, legislative correspondents. General staff, a couple general staff members that you should know about is the executive assistant or scheduler. So every member of Congress has a scheduler, keeps them on time, puts together their briefing packets, and they are the ones that control the member's schedule, which meetings they go into, and where they are at any given point in time. This is somebody that if you have the ability to build a relationship with, they can make access happen when you need to talk to a member of Congress. The other is the staff assistant. When you walk into the front office, this is generally the person who's at the front desk. So they help most of the time with flags, the flag requests, as well as tours of the Capitol building and tours in the area. But the other thing to remember is that when folks come to the Hill, that's usually where they start. They usually start as a staff assistant and they work their way up through legislative staff as they get experience. So this is somebody that may not be particularly helpful to your agenda at the moment, but you should recognize that they're probably going to be there for a while, and you may find them in a different position later the next time you come down.
Just a quick question. How many of you have actually been into a member of Congress's office in D.C.? They're pretty big, right? They're about the size of this table. So the reason I'm saying this is that, so all the staff members you just went through, they're in a very compact area. And you've heard me say it before that you want to treat everyone with respect and courtesy. So if you're a jerk to the very first person you meet, well, you can turn around and leave because you're getting nothing done. And you should treat people with respect anyway, but they take it very seriously. An example I give is, we do residency interviews. What's one of the questions when we meet in our little huddle after interviews is, how do they treat the program coordinator and the staff? If they treat them like garbage, they're dead, done. We throw them out. It's the same thing here. And these are the people who, you can hear are the ones with all the information, but are also the access point, right? So the best thing to do is really antagonize them, right? To make sure you never see anyone. So you'd laugh, but again,
It happens.
We speak from experience, having witnessed it actually happen. But, you know, when you get to know them, though, and they know who you are, it's a whole different scenario, because now you're not a stranger, you're someone who's engaged, and they do try to help you out, especially if you're a constituent. There's a relationship there that you work on. So everyone, no matter how big or small the office, is important, and they all have a role, and they're all connected together, and you need to kind of remember that when you're going in there.
And they're all on an instant messenger system inside the office, so anything that happens in the front office, everybody in the back office knows what's going on.
Sometimes they have to audible when you go visit, and you may get the senator, the chief of staff, the healthcare liaison, or anything in between. When you leave, obviously, kind of closing out and sending a thank you, do you send it to whichever staff you met with? Do you send it to care of the senator? What's the best way to handle that?
I'll handle that on a later slide, but good question. So in general, it's a good idea to send a personal note. If you met with a staffer only, definitely send a note to the staffer with follow-up on what you talked about. If you found that staffer particularly helpful, send the same note to a member of Congress and say, hey, thank you for having your staff meet with me about X issues. This is important for your constituents because they were very helpful in accomplishing this sort of thing. And I'll tell you what happens with that is when the staffer sees a thank you note going to the senator, generally the scheduler identifies that and says, oh, hey, you're mentioned in this thank you note to the member. So that staffer, use human nature to your benefit, right? That staffer is going to walk down and put that on top of the pile for the member of Congress. I'm not kidding. So that's the reality, is use human nature to your benefit. So if you write a note to a member of Congress and you mention a staff member in that, particularly in a positive light, that usually ends up on the top of the stack to go to the member, and then you've gotten your issue in front of the member. So that's one of the keys to remember. All right, so a couple keys on dealing with congressional staff and legislative staff in particular. So DC staff may not be from your hometown, they may not be from your home state, they may not be from your home district. They were generally hired for their policy expertise, not necessarily where they came from. So don't expect that they necessarily understand your geographic or local issues. So you many times have to remember that you need to give context to these folks, especially if they don't come from your home area and this is a provincial or local issue. The second thing is the vast majority have no clinical background. So if you walk in, I had one meeting at one point where somebody went into the genetics of osteogenesis imperfecta with several staff and the senator sitting in the room, lost the whole meeting, right? Nobody has any clue where they're going with this. So keep it on a very layman term level unless you're asked questions, and that generally sells much better. The second suggestion is if you're one of the things that the rate limiting step in getting anything done in a congressional office is the legislative staff have to draft a memo, and it goes through a series of different levels of approval before it gets to the member of Congress. So you're asking a legislative staff member to take a complex policy issue and to summarize the ground level impact of that in a clinical scenario that's going to be convincing to a member of Congress. The reality is the vast majority of the legislative staff don't have the ability to do that, and that's where you all and we all come in, is that we can provide not necessarily the entire memo, but things that can be used in a briefing memo, like a brief clinical vignette on where this policy hurt or helped a particular patient. And provide that, and they can use that in the memo, and that'll speed along the process. And I've seen that happen multiple times. In fact, this is a memo that I had drafted at one point for a piece of legislation that got introduced. It's just very plain language summary. Here are the problems, here's the proposed solution, here's the recommendation. Just very small things right there that all you need to do is put that together as part of a briefing, and the member of Congress, the legislative assistant is not going to send that memo on, but what they is going to do is use that as the basis to form an advisement to the member of Congress.
That memo he wrote, though, wasn't as a staff member. That's when he was doing this.
Correct.
So that's only from a couple years ago. So just so you know,
yeah.
You'll be able to. I think you'll get.
I think you have access to download all the slides too.
You'll have access to the slides, so
yeah.
If not, we can get it to you. Oh.
And that was the wrong button. All right. Another group of DC staff to talk about is the press office. So we all see press secretaries and press coordinators in front of the cameras answering questions all the time. The one thing that's not really seen is that as much as they speak, the press secretaries do a lot more listening. They listen mostly in the Senate, they listen to statewide news, and in the House of Representatives, they listen to statewide and district-specific news. And the way that they do that is that they go through all the local media and all the statewide media every day. They're looking for two things. Is there a member of them? Is there a member of Congress mentioned in any of these articles, news stories, or anything that shows up there? Or what key issues keep coming up? Because one of their jobs is to keep the member of Congress and the staff in DC updated on what the key issues are that are being seen and heard back in the state. So the way that they do that is they call the paper and look for those sorts of things. So what you wouldn't normally think about is that includes letters to the editor. That includes op-eds. So if you write a letter to the editor mentioning a member of Congress, that will end up in front of them, that will end up on their press briefing packet the next day. If you write an op-ed and you've mentioned them, that generally will end up in their press briefing packet. So there's a couple opportunities there. If you have an issue and you're being blocked by staff, if that shows up in an op-ed or in a letter to the editor, that will be marked up almost always and handed to the legislative staff and said with some sort of instruction on what's this, what's going on here, what are we doing? So that's a way to make an end run around staff. It's also a way to express appreciation if a member of Congress has been particularly helpful. This is one of those times where you mention the member of Congress in these sorts of things, not necessarily the staff. It's poor form generally to thank the staff in the media. That's where you would do that with the member. But that's a way to express appreciation that they will definitely see your name printed underneath that, and that serves you well as well. The other challenge is, though, that some people write some pretty incendiary things that show up in letters to the editor and in opinion pieces. Those don't go away. Those are part of the permanent record, and as we'll talk about a little bit later, when you're meeting with a member of Congress, you've generally been Googled before you get down there. So they know what you said and they know what's out there. So we'll talk about that. All right, we talked about the DC staff. Now we're just really quickly we'll quickly go through the local staff. So you notice that the state and local staff, these are folks stationed in the district or in the state for a senator. And you'll notice that the organization is much flatter. So you've got the state director essentially reports to the chief of staff and to the members. So there's much less hierarchy there. So the state or district director basically controls the member's schedule, mostly during recess, whenever they're back in the state. The local staff caseworkers, these are the folks that handle academy nominations and citizenship issues generally. So the state or district director ends up being a pretty powerful person that has a whole lot of influence, and they live pretty close to you regardless of where you live. So a couple things to remember. Build those relationships with your state and district staff. That flatter organization, use that to your benefit. That gets you better direct access to the member, particularly through recess scheduling. And the other thing is invite the staff to come out and visit your facility. Give them a tour as you would give a member a tour, because the reality is there are very few tours that members of Congress go on that their staff didn't already do, to pre-screen and see what sorts of things are going to be there and what sorts of topics are going to come up. It's not always the case, but many times it is the case that the staff will tour a facility first, and then when the member has open time during a recess, the staff's responsibility is to get the member out into the community, seeing what's going on, hearing from constituents, and if that was a good experience and a helpful experience for staff, they will generally try to push it to make sure that the member goes as well. All right, second useless DC trivia. If you're looking at the north side of the White House, how can you tell if the president's in the Oval Office? Anybody? Lights on? Flag? It's the Marine sentry. So if you're looking at the West Wing entrance of the White House, if there's a Marine sentry outside, you can see this from the north face of the White House, then you know that the president is in the West Wing. If the Marine sentry's not there, the president's not in the West Wing. And so as staff, when you're going over to the White House, you kind of always peek to know whether or not the president's in the West Wing. That's one of the ways you can tell. All right, so we talked about the people. Now we'll talk really briefly about the process, how to interact with members of Congress. You can interact directly or indirectly. So what happens with those phone calls, emails, letters, things like that that you send in? Basically, all of them are tabulated as either pro or con by issue, and that's provided in a weekly staff meeting to the entire legislative staff as well to the chief of staff and member of Congress. So And what happens with that is when you send the letter, it's tabulated, then it goes to legislative staff, and then if you're a constituent, you generally will be getting a reply from the member of Congress on that. So why does that matter? Well, it really legitimizes and helps with prioritization. If you come down and meet with a member of Congress and tell them that the most important issue in your state right now to physicians is medical malpractice, the medical malpractice premiums, and we need liability reform, I can walk as a staffer out of that meeting and query how many communications we've received from the state on that issue. If you tell me this is the most important thing going on in the state for physicians and I see that we've received a total of 2 letters over the past 2 years, that tells me that there's either a disconnect or something's wrong. What you're claiming is not actually true. So when this provides, basically the letters, phone calls, emails, they provide legitimacy and they help with prioritizing issues. So the letters themselves may not individually be helpful, but as a collection and as a group, that ends up making your point stronger if you've made sure that the member of Congress hears from you in addition from just being in DC. And second, just quick tip, is all of the handwritten mail that you send down to Washington, D.C. goes through an extensive screening process, including radiation, which many times actually burns the ink off of the letter and onto the envelope, making it unreadable. So emails actually work better than handwritten letters, just so you know. All right. So how can you better be involved in communicating with your member of Congress? So the American College of Surgeons put out surgeonsvoice.com. This is a great resource. If you haven't signed into it, sign into it and use it. Surgeon's Voice will auto-populate letters to your member of Congress with your name, with your address, and your information, and make that text portion editable so that you can make that personal and reflect some of your issues that you're facing in your local area. And then it automatically sends it, and it's a super easy process. There's also briefings on these issues online, and you can basically read the briefing on the issue and then send the information into your members of Congress. Surgeon's Voice includes all of your state and federal legislators there, and essentially one-click access to communicating with them. So it's a great option, and it's a great opportunity to use to quickly contact your member of Congress. All right, so what does this mean in the Senate? The lights and all that combination of weird lights on the clock. Does that mean there's a filibuster, the yeas and nays, the British are coming, or recess during daily session?
They're sentimental.
So the Senate and the House both run on a series of bells and lights on the clock. So when you see someone looking at a clock in DC, it's not necessarily because the meeting's boring, but particularly if you hear buzzing and clicking in the background, the lights are changing. And what that is that's a communication to the member of Congress what's going on the floor. So that particular set of lights is showing essentially that they are out to lunch. So that's recess during daily session. But that's one of the codes on the clock, and the other interesting fact is that the House and Senate have totally different codes. All right, so direct communication. If you are going to talk with a member of Congress, you need to plan for that visit, and we'll talk about execution and then quickly follow up. So when you're going to talk about some issues, research them. There's a number of different ways that you can do that. Start with the American College of Surgeons. They have some great briefing resources online. You can go to the Congressional Research Service, is what every member of Congress and their staff read. It's a nonpartisan organization that provides basically historical background to most issue areas. These briefings are not released to the public, but there are a bunch of people who bootleg them and upload them to the internet anyways. So if you search Congressional Research Service report, and the topic area, there's almost always one that you can find online. That way you know exactly what members and what the staff are actually reading. That's the background that 99% of the briefings come from. You can use think tanks, Heritage, Brookings, Cato, all of the different think tanks will publish on most of these things. Research what the members said. The easiest way to do that is to Google them in the topic area. Most of the time that pulls stuff up. If you want to know if they sponsored, co-sponsored, or how they voted, go to congress.gov. This used to be thomas.libraryofcongress.gov. It's recently converted over to congress.gov, and you can search that. What's a little more user-friendly is Vote Smart. That allows you to search not only what your member of Congress has voted on, but what they've also said about it as well. They link those two things. So once you do that, gather state and local data. Get the most local data possible. What matters to your member of Congress is what affects their constituents. And then prepare a clinical story to emphasize the request. So this is the most important thing, and this is what your member of Congress is going to remember. Why does the president keep people up in the balcony during the State of the Union? It's because everybody remembers the stories about the people in the balcony, right? That's why they do that during the State of the Union. Same thing with members of Congress. If you tell them, I want to talk about drug reimportation. It's $17 billion that's lost, and people are, you can go on and drone about statistics all you want. If you say, look, I have a patient who's spending $600 a month on copays to purchase drugs in the United States, who's now purchasing drugs for $200 a month copay in Canada. We have a problem with our system. Those sorts of very brief, succinct things show up in speeches all the time because that's when they're speaking off the cuff, that's what the member of Congress remembers. And that's what the staff kind of hold on to because remember, they don't have that clinical background to bring that sort of expertise to the discussion. And then manage your online presence. Before you meet with a member of Congress, if the staff knows that you're meeting with a member of Congress, your group will there will be a briefing memo that goes to the member of Congress the day before. That briefing memo generally includes who the group is, what their issues are likely to be, and who's there. And the who's there thing is generally populated by what's on Google and what's out there, just so that the member of Congress has, so that they have some visibility on who they're meeting with. You can find almost anything on Google, it turns out, even if somebody was a childhood actor in a Broadway play. So if you know how to search Google, you can find an awful lot of things. So that means that if you are going to meet with a member of Congress, you should know what they're finding when they search on Google for what you're doing. Meeting pointers. When you go to the meeting, the dress code is business. I've seen people show up in cutoffs and flip-flops. That's generally not how you advance a discussion. Establish rapport. So learn about the member, learn about the staff. That's going to help you target the message. Focus on key policy asks. The easiest meeting for a congressional staffer is the one where you didn't ask for anything. It's just informational. The hardest one is where there's a commitment at the end. I want you to support, I want the member to support this. I want the member to co-sponsor this, to sponsor this legislation, oppose this, sign on to this letter. Very specific things. That's a different meeting than one where somebody just comes and briefs. So this is one that requires some sort of action and response from the office, and you want to make sure that you include that, otherwise you definitely won't get one. And then leave time for dialogue. When the staff are throwing questions at you, it's not their curiosity. They're going to target the questions that they know they're going to be asked in the briefings. If they're going to be putting a briefing memo up saying we should support this or oppose this based on these criteria and what what we're hearing on this particular policy, what they're going to do is they're going to fire a series of questions at you, and that's your window to understand, is there concern with this the cost? Is there concern with this the policy, preemption of state law? What are the things that are going to be most important to the member with this sort of thing? So use those as an opportunity to recognize what the likely objections are, and when you send your follow-up note, your thank you note, things like that, that's what I would spend your time addressing in there as follow-up. Is to make sure to address some of those sorts of things that come up, and don't make stuff up. If you don't know the answer, I'll get back to you, and that's your opportunity for follow-up. So email is best for follow-up because it's cut and pastable, especially if you're providing bullet points that can be used in a memo. Express appreciation, we talked about that. Compliment the staff if they were helpful, particularly in that member letter, because that will end up on the top of the stack, and then your issue gets seen by the member of Congress. And offer to bring folks to the district, to the state, show them what you're doing, don't just tell them. Couple things that you should never do. Quid pro quo. I had one time where somebody walked in and offered me something as a staffer if we would support this particular appropriations request. That gets you kicked out of a member of Congress's office really quickly. You can't even suggest it. The policy and any sort of additional help have to be totally separate. There can't be any evidence that the policy decision was affected by any sort of potential benefit. Second thing, don't threaten. That just gets you nowhere. And the third, don't discuss any fundraising or campaign-related issues on federal property on federal time. That's against federal law. It happens way too frequently with folks who come down and aren't particularly familiar with how DC works. They think that saying, hey, I slipped you some campaign donations, can we talk about this? And that's actually the worst way to go about any sort of policy discussion in DC because the DC staff belong to the federal government, not to the campaign. So there's no winning on that discussion. All right, so this is the last useless DC trivia. How do members of Congress get from their office buildings to and from the Capitol building. Anybody know? Anybody seen this? That's right. So there are subway systems underground and a network of tunnels that connect all of the office buildings on Capitol Hill with the House and Senate and the Capitol building. So that's why you don't see them generally walking outside. They're underground getting to and from the Capitol building. So there you have it. All right. Well, that was just a super brief general overview of congressional staff, kind of a picture from a congressional staff standpoint. And now Ross is going to come up and talk about where we're going from here. Thanks.